The final page was placed before King Charles without ceremony, without witnesses, and without another opportunity for hesitation. For several long seconds, the monarch stared at a line carrying Meghan's name, feeling the immense weight of the crown upon his shoulders. Then, he slowly lifted the pen. One signature later, her HRH designation was ordered removed from the official royal records forever. It was not a warning, a temporary suspension, or a symbolic rebuke. It was the absolute, permanent deletion of a royal identity once protected by the crown. Charles sat motionless as the keeper of the royal records placed a sealed administrative order before him. This specific office handled the monarchy's lasting written decisions, meaning this was no private note or family letter that could later be ignored or rewritten. Two senior aides remained nearby in the dimly lit room, but neither spoke a single word. The king read every line again, knowing the words would outlive the morning and change the landscape of his family forever. The decision was absolute. Charles signed a command removing Meghan's HRH style from active royal records, ceremonial registers, internal correspondence templates, and every future palace document. HRH means Her Royal Highness, a form of address used exclusively by senior working royals. Meghan had already stopped using it publicly after leaving royal duties, but the designation remained legally tied to her history. Now, that connection was formally severed. The king paused because the name belonged to no distant court figure. Meghan was his younger son's wife and the mother of two of his grandchildren. His hand stayed on the page after the pen came down, as though he understood that authority can end a dispute while deepening a permanent family wound. Camilla watched him from across the desk before asking whether he was entirely certain. The queen consort did not challenge his judgment, but she heard the deep finality in the room. Charles kept his eyes lowered and answered that uncertainty was exactly what had damaged the family for too long. She looked at the sign page and understood that he had chosen institutional control over family ambiguity. The order carried an even harsher clause: no private reconciliation, ceremonial courtesy, family letter, or future palace reinterpretation could ever restore Meghan's HRH style. A second sealed copy went immediately to the royal archives, the permanent collection preserving decisions for future reigns. Charles had not acted only for himself. He had built the ruling to survive him. Before the aides left the room, the king asked whether Prince Harry had been informed yet. One aide quietly said no. Charles closed his eyes briefly, feeling the pain of a father. The administrative battle was over, but the family confrontation had not even begun. The ink had dried inside the palace. But thousands of miles away, the two people most affected were still living beneath a title that no longer officially existed. Meghan did not learn the decision through a public announcement. She learned when Prince Harry entered the room holding a short message from London and refused to sit down. His expression told her that this was not another hostile headline or distant palace warning. The crown had acted directly. Her royal designation had not merely been restricted. It had been removed from the records completely. Meghan read the message twice, then placed the phone on the table with deliberate calm. Harry remained standing as the silence thickened around them. The encrypted message had arrived through a private royal channel, a protected line used for sensitive family communication. Yet Charles had not called. No personal explanation accompanied the order, and that absence made the decision feel colder than any public statement could have done. Meghan stared at the wording without blinking. The HRH designation had once confirmed her marriage into the royal family and her place as a working duchess. She had stopped using it publicly, but she believed it would remain part of her history. Now, even that belief had been taken away. The duchess did not shout. She did not throw the phone or demand an immediate response. Instead, she read the message again and asked why the king had chosen permanent removal when the existing restriction had already kept the title out of public use. Her voice stayed calm, but the restraint made the pain more visible. Harry began pacing the room, his anger rising. He accused the palace of punishing his wife to wound him, turning royal procedure into a weapon against their marriage. Meghan stopped him with one sentence. Charles had signed it himself. The prince froze because the truth left no courtier to blame and no advisor to accuse. When Harry said he would call London immediately, Meghan reached for his wrist, asking whether he remove her from a record or completely from a family. He looked back at the message, searching for words of regret or affection. But there were none. The silence answered for him. Harry then noticed the reference number attached to the order. He recognized the coding pattern and realized the process had begun weeks earlier. While private messages from the palace still sounded polite and almost hopeful, this administrative machine was moving in secret. Meghan's expression changed as she remembered a recent request from a royal office asking how she intended to be addressed in future charitable and commercial work. The inquiry had not been routine. It had been evidence of what was coming. Harry reached for his phone again, determined to confront his father. Before he could dial, another message appeared. William wanted to speak first, privately, without any advisors. Meghan had lost the letters attached to her royal identity. But Harry was about to discover that the decision had been triggered by something far more personal than a dispute over protocol. The decision did not begin with a legal memorandum or a sudden burst of anger. It began at a private reception 3 weeks earlier, when a senior guest addressed Meghan as her Royal Highness during a recorded charity introduction. Palace officials expected an immediate correction, but none came. Instead, the designation remained in the event program, appeared in promotional material, and spread across international coverage. By midnight, the king had received the footage, and his patience had reached its limit. Meghan had entered the reception expecting a controlled evening among major donors, business leaders, and invited media figures. The event program, a printed guide listing speakers, titles, and the order of appearances, identified her using the full HRH designation despite the long-standing agreement that she would not use that style after leaving royal duties. The host stepped forward and welcomed her Royal Highness, the Duchess of Sussex. Meghan smiled, approached the microphone, and began her speech without correcting him. The moment lasted only seconds, but the official recording captured everything. That silence became the trigger Charles could no longer ignore. Palace staff had dismissed earlier mistakes as confusion, but this time, the title appeared on the printed program, the digital invitation, the donor material, and the official event recording. The repetition made the incident feel planned rather than accidental, and that distinction changed the entire response from the palace. Charles returned from an evening engagement and watched the clip alone in his private study. He replayed the introduction, listened again, then set the remote down without speaking. The king was not angered only by the words. He was deeply wounded by the absence of correction, because that silence seemed to preserve royal privilege while completely rejecting royal duty. William arrived after being summoned and watched the footage beside his father. The prince argued that another informal warning would simply continue the endless cycle of boundary violations. Charles resisted at first, warning that permanent removal would feel to Harry like an attack on his marriage. Yet the future king replied that endless ambiguity was already damaging the crown itself. A palace aide then presented documented correspondence sent before the reception. Meghan's representatives had been asked to approve the event program, meaning the HRH designation had appeared before the evening began. The evidence did not prove she had personally approved every word, but destroyed the idea that no one around her had seen it. Charles received one final revelation. An organizer had prepared a corrected version, but the change disappeared shortly before publication. No recorded instruction directly linked Meghan to that removal. Still, the monarch concluded that the confusion had become too dangerous to tolerate. After a sleepless night, Charles told William to prepare the strongest available response. The future king agreed, but insisted Harry must eventually hear the real reason directly. One uncorrected introduction had transformed years of tension into a permanent royal judgment, and now two brothers were preparing to argue over whether it was justice or revenge. When Harry answered William's call, neither brother offered greeting, as the invisible wall that had grown between them for years now felt completely solid. The future king stood entirely alone behind a securely closed door in Kensington Palace, staring out at the gray London sky, while the younger prince remained standing beside a darkened window in their California home, watching the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor. No advisors listened to this conversation. No media aides prepared statements in the background, and no courtiers were present to soften the words that were about to be thrown across the ocean. William said immediately that the decision regarding the permanent removal of the style had become completely unavoidable due to recent actions. Harry did not hesitate to strike back. his voice tight with anger as he accused his older brother of engineering the entire situation behind closed doors to satisfy his own agenda. What followed in the next minutes was not a structured debate over royal titles or constitutional protocol. It was the raw, painful release of years of hidden resentment between two brothers who no longer trusted each other's motives, actions, or words. William began by describing the charity reception in detail, explaining that palace staff had reviewed the recorded introduction alongside earlier concerns about royal wording appearing around various Sussex commercial and independent projects. To the palace, royal terminology meant the formal titles and styles connected inherently to the monarchy, and those words carried a historical authority far beyond ordinary commercial branding. The prince admitted openly to his brother that he had advised Charles to end the ambiguity once and for all, though he stressed repeatedly that the king alone held the constitutional power and ultimately signed the final order. Harry completely rejected that distinction, his voice rising as he argued fiercely that Meghan had not introduced herself as Her Royal Highness at the event, and therefore she should not be punished or erased because of another person's choice of language on a stage. He demanded to know exactly why the palace chose a path of permanent administrative removal instead of simply asking for a routine public correction or issuing a standard statement of clarification. His anger sharpened with every passing second because the decision seemed deliberately designed by the institution to make one uncorrected moment define years of complex family conflict. William answered firmly that within the framework of the monarchy, silence could only signal acceptance of a broken boundary. The future king said the true problem was not a single phrase spoken by a host, but rather a consistent pattern in which royal status remained close enough to provide global value, while royal responsibility and duty stayed distant. Harry's voice rose even higher as he accused his brother of judging Meghan by impossible standards that others inside the family had repeatedly escaped without any consequence. The prince refused a comparison entirely and stated coldly that the current conversation concerned one specific agreement, one specific title, and one broken boundary that could not be ignored. The call then shifted from a regular audio line to a secure video connection as Harry moved closer to the screen, telling William to look directly at him while defending what had just happened to his wife. His brother did not look away. He looked back to the screen and said slowly that a royal designation could not be treated as something available when useful for independent work and rejected when inconvenient for institutional duty. Harry struck the desk with his palm in frustration, calling the order a public humiliation created specifically for public consumption to damage their reputation. William did not flinch at the outburst. He answered calmly that the deeper humiliation came from allowing the crown's ancient authority to become negotiable whenever external pressure increased. Then, the truth changed everything as William revealed to the private conversation that Charles had originally proposed a much milder action, a temporary administrative suspension, meaning the designation would have been frozen rather than permanently erased from the records. However, the documented evidence showing that Meghan's own team had reviewed the event program weeks before the reception pushed the monarch toward a permanent ruling. Harry went completely still as the weight of that information settled in the room. He then asked in a quiet, strained voice whether his own princely title would be the next thing taken away by the crown. William paused for a long time, the silence stretching across the connection before he answered that the current order concerned Meghan alone, but future decisions regarding status would depend entirely on Harry's choices. Harry immediately demanded to speak directly to his father, but William warned him that the king's signature would not be reversed by anger. Yet Charles was already waiting by his phone, because he believed some things had to be explained as a parent, not just as a sovereign. The brothers had finally exhausted their anger, but the deepest wound between them remained untouched, as the son still needed to ask his father why the crown had chosen the path of permanence over the path of forgiveness. Charles had spent many years trying to preserve two distinct identities at once. The loving father who wanted his younger son close, and protective monarch who could not allow royal authority to become conditional or negotiable. Meghan's title had forced those two identities into a direct, unavoidable conflict within his own mind. Behind the signed order stood senior advisors, complex legal language, and centuries of strict protocol, but the final choice belonged entirely to one man. When Harry's call finally came through, the king dismissed everyone from the room, closed the door, and answered it completely alone. Charles held the practical authority to decide how royal styles would appear in official records and palace communications, as a royal style was a formal way the institution recognized and addressed a member of the family. Courtiers could advise, lawyers could warn, and officials could prepare the language, but nothing changed until a monarch gave a direct command. The machinery of the palace had already been waiting for this moment. The private secretary who manages a sovereign's official work had prepared the administrative steps. Constitutional advisors had examined the legal limits. Archive officials had arranged a permanent record, and communication staff had drafted the public explanation. Yet every single page remained completely inactive until Charles signed his name. Before answering his son, the king removed his glasses and folded them beside the order, looking toward a framed family photograph on his desk and staying there for several seconds. Triumph never entered his face. He looked deeply exhausted because the decision had successfully protected the institution while cutting much deeper into his own family. Harry asked immediately whether his father had considered what the order would do to Meghan personally. Charles said quietly that he considered it every day for weeks. The prince answered that consideration without compassion was only a slower, more painful form of punishment. His words landed heavily in the silent room, but the monarch did not retreat from his position. Charles insisted that the designation belonged to crown before it belonged to any individual through marriage. Harry countered that the same institution had welcomed Meghan before the world with grand ceremonies and was now rewriting her plays because the personal relationship had become difficult. The king replied firmly that history was not being rewritten. A present privilege was simply being removed because it could no longer function honestly under the current terms. Then Charles revealed to the private conversation that he had actually delayed signing the order twice, waiting for Harry or Meghan to provide a direct, written assurance that the HRH style would never again appear around independent commercial work. No such promise ever reached his desk. The monarch also explained that he had intentionally limited the scope of the punishment. Meghan would remain the Duchess of Sussex, a title permanently connected to her marriage, and her place in royal history would remain untouched. Only the active royal style was being removed from the record. Harry ended the call with a dark warning, stating that the palace might control its written records, but it could not control what this decision would do to the future of the family. Within hours, the first practical consequences of the signed administrative order began arriving in California, showing that the crown's authority becomes real only when it begins closing doors one after another. The removal of the three letters became real not through a grand televised announcement or a dramatic press conference, but through small, precise, and systematic changes across the global network of the monarchy. An official invitation to a prominent international event was quietly withdrawn, a digital archive detailing past tours was corrected, and a longtime palace contact abruptly stopped using the old form of address in correspondence. Then, a security courier delivered the formal physical confirmation directly to Meghan's office, carrying the heavy seal of the state. She opened the envelope completely alone, read the very first page, and discovered that the decision affected far more than just ceremonial language or public protocol. The crown was actively rebuilding its ancient boundaries and placing her permanently outside them without any path back. Meghan read the official administrative notice line by line as she sat at her desk, noting how it strictly ordered royal databases to be updated instantly, ceremonial records to be amended, internal correspondence rules to be changed, and palace offices never again to address her as HRH. Internal correspondence meant the formal letters, secure emails, and administrative documents used inside the royal household, meaning the change would now reach every single office and employee connected to the monarchy. The practical consequences moved with incredible speed as Meghan's team received direct instructions to remove old templates, official biographies, archived event material, and formal references that might suggest she still had legal permission to use the style. The order did not merely change future language. It reached backward into past, forcing her staff to clean away every lingering trace of an identity once recognized by the crown. Meghan sat at her desk with a notice before her and opened a nearby wooden drawer, removing a handwritten card once addressed to her Royal Highness and holding it for several seconds in total silence. The Duchess did not tear the card or throw it away in anger. She placed it carefully back inside the dark drawer, then closed it with a calm that carried far more deep sadness than explosive anger. Harry wanted an immediate, aggressive public response, urging his wife to challenge the legality of the order before the palace completely controlled the global media story. Meghan refused his request immediately, telling him that an angry public statement would allow Charles and William to present her as someone fighting desperately for status when the real issue was personal dignity. The prince argued fiercely that their silence would look like a total surrender to the palace, but she answered that rage could quickly become its own prison. The deepest wound was not the loss of 3 letters. Meghan admitted that Charles had made the decision permanent without ever speaking to her directly, even after both sides had spent years suggesting that a quiet reconciliation remained possible. Harry heard the deep pain beneath her restraint and finally stopped defending immediate action for the sake of action. Then, their legal advisors delivered the next shock to the room. The palace planned to publish a completely revised royal reference list within 48 hours. A royal reference list was the official guide used by international governments, major charities, media organizations, and ceremonial offices when officially naming members of the family, meaning the change would become global and impossible to hide. Harry soon received a separate, private warning stating that any future attempt to present Meghan under the removed style could trigger a much broader review of all Sussex titles and privileges. That evening, Meghan asked Harry to stop making calls to London, as she wanted one final private conversation, not with Charles, William, or another palace official, but directly with Catherine. The man had successfully turned the crisis into a bitter battle over institutional authority, yet Meghan believed only one woman truly understood what it felt like to have identity, duty, and public judgment forced into the same narrow space. There were absolutely no advisors on the line when Catherine answered Meghan's call, no palace note-takers recording the words, and no prepared public relations phrases. For the first time since the permanent order was signed, the 2 women at the very center of the royal divide spoke without husbands, officials, or institutions standing between them. Meghan asked directly whether Catherine had known about the finality of the plan. The princess paused for a long moment, then answered truthfully that she had known an administrative decision was coming, but not that Charles intended to make the removal permanent. Meghan had used an old private number that had remained completely silent for months, and Catherine answered after returning from a family engagement, immediately fearing the call would become another confrontation. Instead, she heard an unexpected restraint, and the future queen understood that the lack of anger made the moment far more serious. Catherine explained that William had discussed the reception incident and the absolute need for clarity, but he had never shown her the final written order. The permanent clause meant the removal could not later be reversed through simple courtesy or quiet family reconciliation, a detail she learned only shortly before Harry received the official message. Meghan then asked whether the palace could truly separate a human being from a title. Catherine took a deep breath before answering that the institution often protected historical roles much better than it protected the actual people carrying them. The honesty changed the entire tone of the call because the princess was no longer speaking as William's wife or Charles's future queen. She was speaking as someone who understood the immense cost of becoming a symbol. Meghan said the decision proved she had been accepted only while obeying expectations she never fully understood. But Catherine answered gently that the HRH style had also carried ancient duties the Duchess no longer wished to perform. Her words were firm but not cruel, refusing to deny the pain while also refusing to pretend the title had ever existed without heavy obligation. Then Catherine admitted what no one close to the king had said aloud. Charles should have spoken directly to Meghan before signing the paper. The princess said the process may have been lawful and controlled, but its absolute silence had made it personally harsh, and that acknowledgement broke the lingering tension between them. Catherine then revealed to the private conversation that the king had rejected a strong proposal from advisors to remove Meghan's Duchess title as well. Charles had insisted that the marriage, the family history, and the permanent connection to Harry must remain officially recognized even while the active royal style disappeared forever. Hearing this, Meghan made her final choice. She would not fight the palace to restore the letters. Instead, she would release one brief statement accepting the administrative decision, while completely rejecting any claim that royal language determined her true worth. Catherine warned that the announcement would dominate global news, but the next morning Meghan answered that the world would simply witness 2 decisions at once: Charles removing the title and her refusing to seek validation from it. By midnight, the private war had changed shape completely, as the question was no longer whether Meghan could keep the title, but whether she could control the true meaning of losing it. At 6 o'clock the next morning, the revised royal record appeared online, showing that Meghan's name, marriage, and Duchess title remained, but the 3 letters once attached to her position were gone. Within minutes, major broadcasters interrupted regular programming. Newspapers replaced their front pages, and small crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace as a decision signed in silence became a global spectacle. Yet the image that defined the morning was not anger. It was a blank space where a royal style had once stood in the records. The palace released a short statement confirming that King Charles had ordered the HRH style removed from Meghan's active royal record, which was the official list used to identify those currently recognized within the working structure of the monarchy. The statement called a change a final clarification of her non-working status, but the careful wording did little to calm the massive reaction across the country. The public divided almost instantly, as some broadcasters described the decision as long overdue clarity after years of uncertainty, while others called it a severe public punishment disguised as an administrative correction. The argument was no longer about 3 letters. It was about whether the Crown had successfully defended its boundaries or used those boundaries to humiliate a family member before the world. The London Chronicle captured the morning with a stark front page beneath a black and white image of the revised register, carrying the headline, 3 letters erased. Copies were pressed against the palace railings as television crews broadcast live, turning the missing title into the most powerful symbol of the entire crisis. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered beneath the Victoria Memorial, where one woman held a sign reading, "A title can be removed, a life cannot." Nearby, supporters of the monarchy applauded Charles for finally ending years of confusion, their cheers mixing with angry voices, proving that the king had created certainty inside the records while unleashing deep division beyond them. Charles watched the coverage without any sound in his study, and when the broadcast showed the crowd, he turned away and asked an aide whether Harry had responded yet. The king's private concern exposed the truth beneath the authority. He still feared the reaction of a wounded son. William remained completely silent in public, but privately told Catherine that the media coverage was far harsher than expected. The prince had anticipated institutional criticism, not a single empty space becoming the dominant symbol of the entire family rupture. Catherine answered him that permanent acts always created permanent images, and the blank line now carried more emotional power than the title ever had. Then, Meghan released her official statement, accepting the change and declaring that service, family, and identity did not depend on a formal form of address. No accusation appeared, no attack followed, and Harry, who had prepared a furious televised response, looked again at Meghan's calm words and deleted his speech entirely. The world expected Harry to answer Crown with explosive rage, but the final verdict would come through what he chose not to say and what the family finally understood in the heavy silence. Harry never delivered the speech his advisors had prepared. He stood before the camera, read the opening accusation, and stopped as Meghan entered the room, placed her hand over the pages, and reminded him that fighting for the letters would allow those letters to define them forever. Across the Atlantic, Charles received confirmation that no legal or public challenge would follow from California, and the conflict ended not with a grand reconciliation, a victory, or an apology, but with both sides finally accepting that their shared royal identity had been severed. Harry released a brief written statement instead, acknowledging that the king controlled official royal records, but condemning the impersonal way the decision had been handled. Meghan acted just as firmly, ordering the style removed from every remaining professional biography, archive template, and independent project connected to her work, preserving only private letters because history could not be erased simply by changing institutional recognition. Charles read Harry's statement alone at his desk, showing no smile and no relief, folding the page once and saying quietly that he hoped his son would one day understand why the boundary had to be drawn. Authority had given him control, but it had definitely not given him peace. While Meghan felt the wound clearly but changed the meaning of the moment by refusing to fight, transforming a public rejection into a personal release. Harry reached his own final conclusion that defending his wife did not require preserving every royal symbol attached to their former life, accepting that their separation from a monarchy was now permanent. Charles protected the clarity of the crown at a high private cost, closing another path toward easy reconciliation. Late that evening, Charles shut the official register and handed it to the archivist, while in California, Meghan closed a drawer containing the old HRH card. Neither side would ever reopen the question, The letters were gone, the order was permanent, and both kept their separate paths, losing only the illusion that everything might one day return to how it was. This was the official end of a shared royal identity and the beginning of two separate futures that would never again be confused.